There is a certain kind of person who moves through chaos with a steadiness that makes everyone else feel louder. In meetings, in arguments, in family emergencies, they do not flare up. Their voice stays even. Their face stays composed. They listen, nod, and somehow find the next sensible step while everyone around them is bracing for impact. We tend to call that maturity. We call it emotional intelligence. We praise it as resilience, like it is proof that they are built stronger than the rest of us. But the calm you can observe from the outside is not always the calm they are living on the inside. Sometimes, what you are witnessing is not peace at all. It is a nervous system that has been stretched for so long that it stopped ringing the alarm. Not because the danger disappeared, but because the body could not afford to keep reacting. When stress becomes chronic, the mind learns a strange economy. It cuts costs, it dulls intensity, it replaces feeling with function. They still show up, they still answer texts, they still do the work, even smile at the right moments. Yet underneath, there is a quiet exhaustion that looks like stability from a distance. Think of it like an emotional marathon run without water stations. At first, you feel every mile. Then you learn to keep moving through pain because stopping is not an option. Eventually, the body goes numb enough to finish, and everyone applauds the finish line without realizing what it took to stay upright. That is why some people seem unshakable. It is not that they have no fear, no grief, no anger. It is that their system learned to carry those forces in silence. So the real question is uncomfortable and necessary. What if calm is not peace, but survival? A nervous system under chronic load does not behave the way it does during a single hard day. Short-term stress is designed to rise and fall. You face a threat, your body mobilizes, and once the moment passes, your system returns to baseline. That cycle is what makes stress survivable. Chronic stress is different because there is no clear ending. The body stays mobilized, not because it wants to, but because it is still waiting for the next impact. Over time, the brain begins treating ordinary life as if it might suddenly become unsafe. Your attention narrows, your muscles hold tension without permission. Sleep becomes lighter, less restorative, because the body is half listening even in the dark. Psychologically, this is where people start confusing control with safety. When you cannot trust calm to last, you try to predict what will interrupt it. You become mentally busy, not because you love to think, but because thinking feels like scanning. You start reading tone, timing, and facial shifts as data. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You replay them after they end. None of this is irrational in a system that learned surprise is expensive. The cost is that presence becomes harder, even in good moments. Part of the mind stays on patrol. This is why someone can look stable while feeling strangely distant from their own life. They are functioning, but not resting. They are productive, but not settled. They can make decisions, support others, even perform warmth. Yet inside there is a muted sense that safety is conditional. In psychology, you could describe it as a body living closer to activation than ease, where regulation becomes effort instead of a natural return. That is the quiet tragedy of chronic load. It does not always create obvious breakdowns. Sometimes it creates a person who works flawlessly while slowly losing access to the simple feeling of being okay. Resilience is one of those words that sounds flattering until you look at what it often demands. We praise it like a virtue, as if it is proof of character, as if the resilient person chose discipline over collapse and courage over fear. But a lot of what people call resilience is not a deliberate strength. It is an adaptation. It is what happens when the nervous system learns that breaking down is not an option, because no one is coming to carry you, because the cost of falling apart is too high, because life keeps moving whether you are ready or not. In that context, enduring is not heroic, it is necessary. This is why some people appear so composed. They did not wake up one day and decide to be strong. They were taught, through repetition, that emotional intensity had consequences, that softness could be punished, that showing need could invite disappointment. Over time, their mind stopped asking for permission to be okay and started doing what it had to do to keep the day going. That is resilience as survival, not as triumph. It is less like a medal and more like a reflex. And it leaves marks that others can sense even if they cannot name them. A certain gravity in the room, an eye contact that feels deeper than the moment calls for, A gentle way of listening that suggests they have spent years tracking what people mean beneath what they say. Even their pauses carry history. They hesitate before answering, not because they lack confidence, but because they have learned to measure impact. To them, emotional reactions are expensive, so they move carefully, like someone who has lived through enough storms to know that calm is not always peace. Sometimes it is restraint built from experience. When a person lives in emotional overload for long enough, the mind does not simply endure it the way it endures a rough week. It reorganizes. This is where the idea of emotional overcompensation becomes useful, not as a diagnosis, but as a description of how intelligent the brain can be when it is trying to keep you alive. If your environment has taught you that emotions create consequences, that conflict escalates quickly, or that your needs will not be met reliably, the nervous system starts building a different strategy. It stops aiming for ease and starts aiming for prevention. Over time, the brain treats safety less like a feeling and more like a calculation. Instead of resting inside the present, it leans into prediction. It looks for patterns, scans for shifts, and tries to reduce uncertainty before uncertainty becomes pain. This is why some people seem hyper-controlled. They are not controlling because they want power. They are controlling because unpredictability once meant danger. Their system learned that being prepared hurts less than being blindsided. In psychological terms, this is a protective adaptation. The mind trades spontaneity for vigilance, emotional expression for restraint, and trust for monitoring. The person becomes skilled at reading rooms, managing outcomes, and keeping things smooth, because smoothness feels like the closest thing to safety. Their brain begins prioritizing what will keep life stable over what will make life joyful. This is the part that is easy to miss from the outside. Emotional overcompensation can look like maturity. It can look like discipline. It can look like someone who is impressively composed, but internally, it often feels like constant management. And that management has a cost. When your system is built around prevention, it becomes difficult to relax even when nothing is wrong. Calm moments feel temporary, like something you are renting instead of something you owned. You can still be kind, productive, dependable, and emotionally perceptive, yet you may feel strangely guarded in your own happiness. The brain is not trying to ruin peace. It is trying to protect it by staying ahead of whatever might threaten it. That is the paradox. The same adaptation that kept someone functioning can also keep them from fully feeling safe, because their sense of safety was never learned through rest. It was learned through anticipation. The first thing people notice is the vigilance, though they rarely call it that. They just say, "You're so observant," or "You always know when something's off." What they are really seeing is a nervous system trained to detect shifts before they become threats. A slight change in tone, a pause that lingers too long, a smile that does not reach the eyes, a foot tapping under the table. These details register like signals on a radar screen. Hypervigilance is not paranoia in the dramatic sense. It is pattern recognition shaped by experience. When your past taught you that small cues often preceded big consequences, you learn to read people the way others read weather, watching for the pressure drop before the storm arrives. Then there is the overthinking, which looks like intelligence from the outside and feels like survival from the inside. People assume it is just a busy mind, but it is often a mind trying to stay prepared. Overthinking is what happens when your system believes that being caught off guard is more painful than being exhausted. So the brain runs simulations. It rehearses what you will say if someone gets upset, what you will do if plans fall apart, what it will mean if a message goes unanswered. It is not that you enjoy worry, it is that your mind treats preparation like protection. In psychology, anticipation can become a coping strategy, a way to create the illusion of control when certainty has never felt available. The cost is constant mental motion, even in moments that should be simple. Conflict avoidance is another trait that gets mislabeled as being easygoing. People think you are calm because you do not argue, but often you are calm because you have learned what conflict can cost. You take the long route around tension the way someone walks around broken glass. You choose softer words, delayed responses, quieter exits, because the goal is not to win, it is to stay safe. This is not weakness. It is nervous system math. If earlier in life conflict meant escalation, rejection, or emotional chaos, the body learns that peace is maintained by prevention, so you become skilled at de-escalation. You smooth, you redirect, you absorb. You might even look diplomatic, but sometimes it is simply the body refusing to enter a space it associates with harm. Another pattern is the strange ability to soothe other people while you are shaking inside. You can be the steady voice in the crisis, the one who says the right thing, the one who makes everyone feel held. This is often mistaken for natural leadership or emotional strength, but many people learned it early because keeping others regulated was the safest way to keep the environment predictable. If you could calm the room, you could reduce the risk. So comfort becomes instinct. You learn to read what someone needs, offer reassurance, stabilize their feelings, and carry your own quietly until later, or until there is no later. That is why some people are incredible caretakers and terrible receivers. They know how to give safety, but they do not trust it enough to ask for it. Finally, there is the way they shrink when attention turns toward them. People call it humility, or shyness, or being private. But sometimes it is a memory stored in the body. Being seen once meant being targeted, judged, or made responsible for someone else's emotions. So visibility feels unsafe. They downplay achievements, soften opinions, make themselves smaller in conversations, because the nervous system prefers invisibility to risk. This is how survival skills get mistaken for personality. The world calls them calm, mature, and understanding. The truth is more complex. Much of that character was built as protection, and it deserves to be recognized not as a flaw, but as evidence that the person learned how to endure. People love to call it maturity when someone is steady under pressure, wise in conflict, and unusually composed for their age. You've always been so grown, they say, as if that growth happened naturally, as if it was the result of guidance, patience, and a safe place to soften. But there is another kind of maturity that is not given. It is extracted. It is pulled out of a person by circumstances that never made room for innocence. When life demands that you stay functional too early, you learn lessons before you are ready to carry them. You learn how to read the room because no one explains what is happening. You learn how to regulate your face because showing emotion creates problems. You learn how to anticipate moods because unpredictability has consequences. That kind of maturity does not come from being nurtured. It comes from being exposed. It is wisdom built from repeated contact with stress, not from a stable foundation that allowed you to develop at your own pace. Psychologically, this is why some people feel older inside than their years suggest. They became competent, not because they were encouraged, but because they were required, and the cost is subtle. They may look calm, but that calm often carries a quiet grief for the version of themselves who never got to be careless, never got to be held, never got to be messy without punishment. Early maturity can earn admiration, but it can also hide a truth that deserves compassion. They were not naturally strong. They were simply not allowed to be anything else. People like this are often remarkably gentle, and it is not the kind of gentleness you learn from comfort. It is the kind you develop after you have tasted pain closely enough to recognize it in other people's voices. They notice what others overlook. The strain behind a joke, the hesitation inside a yes, the way someone keeps talking when what they really want is permission to fall apart. That sensitivity becomes empathy, not as a personality trait, but as a skill shaped through exposure. When you've had to read emotional weather to stay safe, you become fluent in it. But empathy like that is rarely free. It carries a quiet exhaustion that stays hidden because these people are so good at functioning. They know how to stabilize others, how to find the right words, how to be the calm presence in someone else's storm. Yet when it is their turn to need support, something in them tightens. Asking for help can feel like risk. Depending on someone can feel like walking into uncertainty with your eyes closed, because in earlier chapters of their life, dependence often came with disappointment, withdrawal, or consequences they could not control. So they become self-sufficient, and then they become isolated, not because they dislike people, but because needing people never felt safe. This is the paradox. They can carry other people beautifully, but they struggle to let anyone carry them. They will listen for hours, but they will minimize their own pain in 2 sentences. They will show up for everyone, then disappear quietly when they are the one running low. And from the outside, that looks like strength. Inside, It often feels like a private fatigue, the kind that comes from being emotionally capable but emotionally alone. There is often a quiet emotional duality inside people who learn to survive this way. On one side, they feel deeply. They can love with intensity, notice beauty with sharp sensitivity, and sense the emotional truth of a moment before anyone names it. On the other side, they can detach with surprising speed, not because their feelings are fake, but because their system knows how dangerous it can be to stay fully open for too long. That detachment is not coldness. It is a protective reflex that turns closeness into something carefully measured. This is why happiness can make them uneasy. Warmth feels good, but it also triggers analysis. They start asking what it means, how long it will last, and what it will cost if it changes. Instead of simply receiving comfort, they evaluate it. They look for inconsistencies, because inconsistency has a history. When care was unpredictable in the past, the mind learns that stability is never guaranteed, and the safest move is to remain slightly prepared for the shift. So they might hesitate to trust peace. They might study kindness before believing it is real. They might keep one foot outside the moment, not because they do not want it, but because their nervous system remembers what it felt like to be abandoned after finally relaxing. In psychological terms, this is what happens when protection becomes automatic. They can be tender and guarded at the same time, longing for safety while bracing for loss, and that tension shapes how they love, how they hope, and how they hold themselves in the world. When they get overwhelmed, they rarely explode. They rarely raise their voice or make a scene. Their nervous system does something quieter and, to outsiders, easier to miss. They begin to withdraw in small ways that look like moodiness if you do not understand the pattern. They talk less. Their texts get shorter. Their laughter becomes smaller, almost polite. They show up, but their presence feels thinner, like they are standing a step behind themselves. This is not manipulation. It is protection. When the system is overloaded, it chooses the lowest risk option, which is to reduce exposure. Less conversation means fewer chances to be misunderstood. Less emotional expression means fewer openings for conflict. And even when they feel shaky inside, they will often say, "I'm fine," because they do not want to become a burden, and they do not want to retell the story that made them this careful in the first place. In psychology, avoidance is not always a lack of care. Sometimes it is the only way a person knows how to keep themselves intact. If this sounds like you, it does not mean you are broken. It means your nervous system learned a set of rules that once made perfect sense. In the environments where you had to become composed, alert, and capable, those responses were not flaws. They were logic. They were your mind doing its job, protecting you with the tools it had at the time. What other people call calmness, maturity, or wisdom is often the visible surface of an invisible history. And there is something quietly beautiful in that. You took what could have hardened you into cruelty and turned it into understanding, restraint, and compassion. You became a steady presence for others, sometimes before anyone was steady for you. But healing does not require you to lose that depth. It asks you to update the system that carries it, to learn boundaries so your empathy stops becoming self-sacrifice, to practice regulation so calm becomes rest, not numbness, to notice when a trauma-trained instinct is speaking, and gently check whether it matches the present. And over time, you can choose softness again, not as a risk, but as something safe. You may still wish your past had been gentler. Still, you have the power to make your future softer than what shaped you.